Welcome to another episode of the Watchdog with me, Lowkey, on Mint Press. We are dependent on your support, so please do help us by liking, sharing, subscribing on this video, and also supporting us on Patreon if you are able to. Now, this week we are joined by a fantastic contributor who has previously been on the show and someone who always offers up a clear-eyed analysis of geopolitical issues, and somebody who is really going to help us today get our head round this fascinating shift, which he has been speaking about for a long time, actually. It is none other than Ben Norton. Ben, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thanks, Lowkey. It's always a real pleasure. Thanks for having me.
So to start with, Ben, if you could just break down for us quickly, what exactly is the BRICS as a unit?
BRICS stands for Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa. Originally, it was known as the BRIC, and then South Africa joined in 2010. This is an organization that was created as basically an alliance of developing nations, largely in the global South. And the term ironically originates with financial analysts who were talking about the rise of the so-called emerging markets, which were largely in Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa. And it was seen as basically an alternative bloc to the G7, the group of 7 countries, which are essentially the Western imperialist countries plus Japan. So you have the US, Canada, European nations, and Japan. And the BRICS as a bloc has continued to develop and create new infrastructure, economic and financial infrastructure, to challenge the Western institutions like the IMF, the International Monetary Fund, and the World Bank. And these are institutions that have historically been used by the United States as kind of political weapons. The only country that has veto power in the IMF and the World Bank is the United States. And they're notorious for imposing structural adjustment policies on indebted countries, which are largely in the global South. And structural adjustment is a nice way of saying cutting wages, cutting worker protections, privatizing state assets, increasing taxes on the working class. So neoliberal economic policies. And in the 1980s and 90s, into the 2000s, much of the global South was suffering under these policies. So these countries with large developing economies got together and decided to create an alternative, which is known as the New Development Bank, or known commonly as the BRICS Bank. And this is a direct alternative to the World Bank, which again, like the IMF, is dominated by the United States. The US is the only country with veto power. And what we now see is the BRICS system is expanding. And originally, it was mostly an economic alliance, trying to help countries in the global South mutually develop each other in ways that are mutually beneficial. But it's also kind of expanded, and there's now political cooperation. There's cooperation on education, combating climate change, on public health issues. Essentially, it's become the anti-G7, right? The opposite to the G7. And what we now see is around the global South, there's a lot of interest in joining BRICS. So we see more and more discussion of the idea of BRICS Plus. And we know that there are 19 countries that have expressed interest in joining. In fact, according to South Africa's ambassador to the BRICS, there are 13 countries that have formally applied to join, and there are 6 that have expressed interest informally. We don't know all of them. According to Russia's foreign minister, Sergei Lavrov, he named specifically in Latin America, Argentina, and Mexico. In Asia, we know that Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, and Indonesia have expressed interest in joining, and Iran has applied to join. And in Africa, we know that Nigeria is interested and Egypt is interested. And the South African ambassador said there are 2 East African countries that are also interested. He didn't name them, but maybe it's Ethiopia, maybe Eritrea. So what we see is the system is now expanding, and essentially what it's becoming is an economic institution framework to represent developing countries in the global south who want to seek new forms of finance and development support, because for hundreds of years, but especially in the past few decades, many of these countries have been trapped in debt and prevented from significantly developing their economies because of the bias and the political orientation of these groups like the IMF and the World Bank. And it's important, by the way, to keep in mind that the IMF and World Bank have their origins in 1944 in the Bretton Woods Conference. And this was the conference held at the end of World War II, in which the US dollar was made the global reserve currency. So it's no coincidence that these Bretton Woods institutions, the IMF and the World Bank, are reflective of the economic and political power of Washington, because it was Washington that helped create them at the same moment when it made its own currency the global hegemonic currency.
Thanks for that, Ben. And also, I remember a little while when we spoke about the possibility of Saudi Arabia, for example, joining the BRICS, you were somewhat skeptical. And also when we think about the way in which the war in Ukraine, the proxy war that NATO has been pushing for some time, we've seen the US consolidate its power in Europe, but also lose a lot of its sway with traditional allies. So, for example, I am someone who watches the Arabic press, and I have noticed that Sky News Arabic, who actually its editorial line is largely influenced by the UAE government, for example. Sky News, of course, is a Murdoch claw, which was supportive of NATO's war in Afghanistan, to the extent that literally the foreign news editor of Sky News during that time, Lorna Ward, was simultaneously an employee of NATO. But Sky News today, Sky News Arabic, has a show called Min Moscow, from Moscow in Arabic, and it transmits a Russian perspective on the war in Ukraine, on Sky News of all things. You look at Nigeria, for example, it has been very key to US hopes for AFRICOM. So these are key US allies. Nowhere receives more US military aid than Egypt, for example. It's close between Egypt and Israel. And these states taking this position is pretty significant, wouldn't you say? And how is your perspective on this issue of Saudi Arabia and the idea that it may join the BRICS?
Well, the last time we spoke, which was only a few months ago, I was much more skeptical, but a lot has changed in just a few months. I mean, what's interesting is if you look at the political contradiction of Saudi Arabia, it's very similar to that of Egypt as well. So we can talk about both of them. Clearly, these are longtime US allies that for decades were essentially used by Washington and to a lesser extent London and Brussels to try to weaken a lot of the resistance in the rest of the region. And we know, for instance, that Egypt was one of the first Arab countries that normalized relations with the Israeli apartheid regime. And there were many discussions when Donald Trump was president that Saudi Arabia would soon normalize relations with apartheid Israel. However, what we've seen is a few changes. First of all, you mentioned the war in Ukraine that was really an eye-opener to a lot of the global south for a few reasons. One, because the West imposed brutal sanctions on Russia and also stole half of the Russian central bank's foreign exchange reserves, which includes around $300 billion of dollar assets and euro-denominated assets that were held by what was essentially the Russian people, the Russian government's money, right? And that was stolen by the West. So that was a very wake-up kind of moment for a lot of countries, because they say, if we do something that the West doesn't like, they can simply steal all of our US dollar and euro denominated assets, which is something I think we're going to talk about today, because that's fueling de-dollarization. So the economic war being waged against Russia is an important element, because it showed many countries that they have to be very careful, because they could be the next country to be targeted. First, it was Iran. Iran's central bank reserves were stolen and sanctions were imposed. Then it was Venezuela. Still today, the Bank of England refuses to give back the more than $1 billion worth of gold that it stole from Venezuela. Then the US stole $9 billion of Afghanistan's central bank reserves. And then it was Russia. So now countries that have historically been allies, but are trying to maintain a more neutral policy are getting concerned, and they're hedging their bets. So that's one aspect. Another significant aspect is that the US has been going around the world and basically bullying countries to join them to isolate Russia, despite the fact that this goes against their economic interests. And when we talk about Russia, we also have to talk about China, which form very much a kind of strategic bloc. Now, Russia is one of the world's largest producers of oil, gas, wheat, and fertilizer. Many countries around the world, especially in the global south, are very heavily dependent on importing oil, gas, wheat, and fertilizer. They need these things to run their economies so people don't starve, so people have cars running, so people have electricity. And not only have the sanctions on Russia tried to prevent other countries from buying these commodities from Russia, but they've also led to a massive increase in commodities prices because these are global markets, right? And the sanctions on Russia led to oil prices to skyrocket. And you all, Kareem, in Europe very much know the effects of that. I mean, with skyrocketing energy prices, with the cost of living crisis, a lot of this is directly related to the war in Ukraine and the proxy war. So many countries in the global south said, we're not going to go along with this Western war. It's not our war. We want to maintain more of a non-aligned foreign policy. We've seen the non-aligned movement is really picking up steam again. And a lot of that is because it's in their economic interest. Now, I mentioned China. Another significant aspect here, China and Russia form a very important bloc. They are strategic partners. They have a comprehensive strategic partnership, as they call it. And they're also both part of the BRICS system, of course. And China now has the world's largest economy. If you look at a measurement of its GDP, which is the size of its economy, but measured by purchasing power parity, which is a much more accurate measurement based on the purchasing power of the local currency and a basket of goods in that country, as opposed to just nominal GDP in dollars, that metric shows that China has the world's largest economy. For a few years now, it's been larger than the US economy, and it's growing between 5 and 6% per year. So it's going to keep overtaking the Western economies and grow further. What that means is that for many countries, especially in the global south, trade with China is actually more important than trade with the United States, or even trade with many Western countries. Not only because, China offers more favorable trade arrangements, but China is the factory of the world. And what percentage of consumer goods around the world consumed in countries is made in China? A huge percentage, right? Especially technologies that they can't produce locally, that they have to import from another country. So by the US trying to pressure countries around the world to cut their ties, not only with Russia, but also with China, the US is basically telling them to commit economic suicide. And I mean, it's not even just, countries like Egypt and Saudi Arabia that are maintaining more non-aligned foreign policy. Ostensibly, there even are some European leaders who want to try to do the same thing, although whether or not they can is up for debate, right? So Macron, the French president, just visited Beijing and met with President Xi Jinping. And then he gave the speech in which he said that Europe cannot be simply vassals and followers of the United States. We have to maintain strategic autonomy. Now, what Macron is saying is exactly what many other people around the world are saying, even in longtime allies like Saudi Arabia and Egypt. By the way, what is the largest trading partner of Saudi Arabia? It's not the US, it's China. By the way, for 10 years now, what has been the largest purchaser of oil from Saudi Arabia? It's not the United States, it's China. So China is Saudi Arabia's most important trade partner, its most important market for its oil. It's very similar for the United Arab Emirates, for Qatar. These countries, despite their reactionary role in the region that they're in supporting often forces that go against the resistance, right? At the same time, they have their own economic interests, and that explains largely why they're trying to maintain this more non-aligned foreign policy. Now, at the same time, Washington has been really doing something very stupid, which is antagonizing these countries that had historically basically been client regimes, which is only further pushing them closer to China and Russia. So, for instance, everyone knows that Saudi Arabia, I mean, it was basically created as a state by the British Empire. And then famously in 1945, on his last Valentine's Day, on the 14th of February, US President FDR met with King Ibn Saud, and he met with him in a US ship, and said that famously the US would provide military support and protect Saudi Arabia in return for Saudi Arabia's cooperation in the global oil market. And then in the 1970s, that was expanded into an agreement signed by the Richard Nixon administration, in which Saudi Arabia agreed to sell all of its oil in the dollar. And that was in 1974. That was 3 years after President Nixon took the US dollar off of gold, so it became freely floating. So by pressuring Saudi Arabia and signing an agreement in 74 to sell its oil in dollars exclusively, that meant that many countries around the world in the global south that don't have oil, that need to import their oil, they have to get dollars. And that increases global demand for dollars, which increases the value of the dollar and helps maintain the stability of the dollar, and allows the US to weaponize the dollar, and allows the US also to maintain a massive current account deficit, which means it's constantly importing way more than it's exporting. So it's draining wealth from the global south and basically buying all these goods for free by just printing money. And that was all undergirded by the petrodollar system. However, now what we see now is that Saudi Arabia is, for the first time since the 70s, is considering selling its oil in another currency, specifically the Chinese yuan, the renminbi. And we saw for the first time that the United Arab Emirates is now selling liquefied natural gas to China through a French company using China's currency, the yuan. So what all this shows is that, again, I mean, we can recognize that Saudi Arabia is a very reactionary regime. I don't have much confidence in, it's never going to be part of like the Maqawamah, the resistance in West Asia, right? But because it's trying to hedge its bets and maintain a non-aligned foreign policy and balance the West against China and Russia, it is becoming more independent. And now, as China is helping to broker peace talks, like China brokered these very important negotiations that normalize relations between Saudi Arabia and Iran. And we now see that after that, Saudi Arabia and Oman participated in peace talks in Yemen with the northern government in Yemen, led by Ansar Allah, known as the Houthi movement. What we see is, and this is multipolarity, these countries that had for decades basically been Western puppets are now basically playing different sides. And that doesn't mean that we look to them for political guidance, but it does mean that that's an example of how imperialism is weakening. And China is essentially leading a new pole. And of course, Saudi Arabia is not part of that pole led by China, which is like the resistance anti-imperialist pole, but it's refusing to pick simply one side. Like in the first Cold War, the majority of the global south also refused to simply pick a side. That's often forgotten. When we talk about the Cold War, it wasn't that cold for many people in the global south, where the US backed coups and wars and regime change operations. But the whole point of the non-aligned movement, created after the Bandung conference in the 1950s, was many countries in the global south saying that they simply want to develop. And if the Soviet Union at that time and other countries could offer them more favorable arrangements, they would go with them. If the West was willing to offer them more favorable arrangements, they would go with them. But their goal is simply to develop.
Absolutely, Ben. And you've given us a bit of the foundation of de-dollarization and the way that the BRICS is playing that very, very important historical service to humanity, I would argue, actually. However, what you previously have mentioned is the way in which India kind of represents the weakest link in that BRICS setup. Could you expand on that, please?
Yeah, well, like I said, and as we see this increasingly multipolar world, the strategy by the United States to maintain its unipolar imperial hegemony is similar to the strategy it waged in the first Cold War, which is to try to divide the world into two poles, not multiple, but rather into two poles, making a bipolar world through a new Cold War. So the US is going around diplomatically, it's actually not diplomatically, its diplomats are going around undiplomatically and telling countries, bullying them, you have to join us or you're with the terrorists. As George Bush said, you're either with us or you're with the terrorists, right? So China and Russia have increasingly formed this kind of political bloc And you could say that the BRICS is the main representation of it, but even within the BRICS, there are a lot of contradictions. So it represents that, the BRICS as an economic organization doesn't mean that every single country within it has the same foreign policy. Obviously not. So for instance, India is an example of this, like Saudi Arabia, a country that still has very good relations with the West. In the case of India, actually, unlike Saudi Arabia, India has very tense relations with China for a variety of reasons. One, India sees China as an economic threat. I mean, it's very interesting actually to look at China's revolution. It succeeded in 1949 on October 1st, and India got independence from British colonialism in 1947. So around the same time period. But if you look at the economic growth of India as compared to China, it's night and day. I mean, the Chinese economy has grown many times greater and faster than India's economy has. Part of that is especially because India in the last few decades has adopted a lot of neoliberal economic policies, especially as it moved more toward the West. Whereas, of course, China has a socialist-led government with a mixed economy, but led by the state, with state control of the banking sector. So finance is run by the state. All land is owned by the state. Around 40% of the GDP comes from state-owned companies. So there's nothing even comparable in India. And so India sees China as an economic threat, as a challenge. But then there are some border disputes between India and China. And also simply India wants to be the main power in Asia. And, they don't want to share power with China or something like that. And also China has very good relations with Pakistan, which of course is, India's arch enemy. So Pakistan has been incorporated into an infrastructure project as part of the Belt and Road Initiative. It's called the CPEC, the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor. And then finally, the current Indian government is even more anti-China than the previous Indian government. The current Indian government is very far right. It's led by a party called the BJP, which is a Hindu nationalist party that follows an ideology that's known as Hindutva, which is very extreme, very Islamophobic, basically sees Indian Muslims, who represent around 10% of the Indian population. And considering there are 1.4 billion Indians, we're talking about over 100 million Indian Muslims who are treated as second-class citizens, third-class citizens under this current government. So the point is that it's very xenophobic. And the BJP under Prime Minister Narendra Modi has also scapegoated China as, just as the US and, Trump, but also Democrats, but especially Trump always talked about China, scapegoating it as part of his tactics, right? The BJP in India has done something very similar. And so the point is that that's a very tense contradiction within the BRICS system. However, what's also strange and interesting is that India has very good relations with Russia, largely because during the first Cold War, India and the Soviet Union were very close allies. And still today, even after the end of the Soviet Union, Russia and India have an important trading relationship. India buys wheat and fertilizer and energy from Russia. And in fact, since this new escalation of the war in Ukraine that began in 2014 with the US-backed coup that overthrew Ukraine's democratically elected, geopolitically neutral government and installed a pro-Western regime, this new phase of the Ukraine proxy war has pushed India and Russia even closer together because Russia lost its markets in the West for its oil and gas and wheat. So instead, it's now selling its energy and wheat to India below market value. So India is getting a really good deal. And then India is actually, in some cases, selling that oil at market value or above to Europe. So Europe is still paying for more expensive Russian energy, just not directly from Russia. But the point is that, so even within the BRICS, India has very complex relations with China, but close relations with Russia. And India, of all the countries in the BRICS, is the closest to the United States. And India is also part of what's known as the Quad, the Quadrilateral Security Dialogue, which is basically an anti-China Asian NATO. It consists of the US, Australia, Japan, and India. So there is a very good former Indian diplomat, M.K. Bhadrakumar, who has an article called India Has the BRICS Blues. And it talks about how for a variety of reasons that I mentioned, and also because the BRICS is moving toward the left with the return of Lula da Silva, the left-wing president in Brazil, and with China's consistent term back toward the left. We see that the BRICS system is moving in a left-wing direction. India is moving in a very right-wing direction. So that's a very complex contradiction, but it's also something that, you know, that in Asia is going to have to be worked out as part of this process of Asian integration, because it's not just the BRICS. India is part of another organization that's related called the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. And among the members of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization are Russia, China, India, and Pakistan. Iran just joined, and there are numerous Central Asian nations like Kazakhstan that are members. So India and Pakistan being members of the same organization shows that despite the hostility, they can maintain membership in these multilateral Asian organizations. So I don't think India is going to necessarily withdraw from the BRICS. However, I think the U.S. strategy right now, it's very clear that the U.S. is on a diplomatic offensive trying to woo trying to woo India as an attempt to isolate China and as an attempt to try to divide the BRICS system. However, to be fair to India, despite, you know, I mentioned all of the very many problems with the Indian government, which is very far right, very Islamophobic, the reality is India is a major power. India is a massive country. It's actually the most populous country on earth. It just overtook China. It has 1.4 billion people. And regardless of who's in power, Indian leaders are going to want to do what's best for India itself. So I don't think that India is going to be like a U.S. puppet. However, it may decide at some point to strategically ally with the U.S. against China, which of course would be completely dangerous for this attempt to try to unite Asia.
Absolutely. And Ben, what do you think is the significance of Dilma Rousseff's role at the BRICS?
It's extremely important. I mean, as I mentioned, it reflects the BRICS move toward the left. And Dilma Rousseff, for people who don't know, was the former president of Brazil from the left-wing Workers' Party. She was overthrown in a soft coup in 2016. And she is a close ally of Lula da Silva, also of the left-wing Workers' Party. And Lula just took a trip to China in this April. He signed 15 agreements with China, and one of those includes an agreement for China and Brazil to trade in their local currencies, the Brazilian real and the Chinese yuan. So they're de-dollarizing their trade. And when he was in Shanghai, Lula visited the headquarters of the BRICS Bank, the New Development Bank, for the ceremony swearing in Dilma Rousseff as the new president. And they both gave powerful speeches emphasizing the New Development Bank is the bank of the Global South. Its goal is to fight poverty and inequality, to combat climate change, to fund infrastructure and renewable energy development. And specifically, it is an alternative to the Western dollar-dominated system. Lula gave a powerful speech saying, we need to get off the dollar. The dollar is being used to oppress us. We should use our own local currencies to help develop the Global South. So what this shows is that the New Development Bank is taking a more activist direction. It's moving in a left-wing direction. It's going to be specifically about helping the Global South develop and fight poverty. And in that sense, it couldn't be any more different from the World Bank. And it's also a sign, by the way, that China wants to show the world that the BRICS is not simply led by China, that China doesn't plan on replacing the US as the global hegemon. It wants a truly multipolar world, and it encourages countries like Brazil to stand up on the global stage and say that we deserve an important role in helping to lead the world as well. And these Western countries that have dominated the world for hundreds of years are not the policemen of the planet.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Ben. You know, we could talk forever. It's always great to hear from you. I appreciate you taking this time for us today. And thank you to all of the viewers that have tuned in to the Watchdog for this week.
Thanks, Kareem.